and work through that as opposed to being anxious to jump to, just the good or bad side of the equation.
Well, logic would suggest, certainly suggest. I mean, when stop and frisk was first put in by NYPD, years ago, the cops were armed with just their general
stop, question, and frisk.
Stop, question, and frisk.
Stop, question, and frisk.
But it was, to a degree, it was I'll use the word profiling of somebody that they think that there was a crime that was committed, kind of looks like this, kind of looks like that, right? Or their judgment of, mannerisms or whatnot as to somebody, was suspicious or not. That's a lot more subjective and a lot more at risk of being wrong than as this technology moves along to be aided. If you actually have the identification of a person, that is a suspect, to be aided with that much more accurate filter, that's much fairer, to everybody involved, that they're not going to be, falsely suspected, of a crime.
But the part that bothers me about all of it is that, again, yes, it is the technology and it is a tool to be used, but it's not the be all and end all, right? If spent 20 years, practicing law enforcement, right? If I had someone who was identified in facial recognition popped up and said, here's your suspect, I couldn't go out and lock that person up based solely on that picture. And that's where I think the argument keeps getting lost, is that it's not the automatic identifier. It's not the DNA. And you're not locking that person up because of that picture. You need to have all the other supporting evidence to go with it. You need the fingerprints. You need the DNA. You need the eyewitnesses. Right? You need the statements. You need all of that to put together the case. It drives me absolutely crazy when people say, well, facial recognition shouldn't be used as a bad technology. Why? I mean, the fact of if you could effect an arrest based on the computer spitting out your picture, saying you're the guy, okay, then I can see them bitching about it. But how do you bitch about something where, hey, how many times does the system spit out a couple of pictures, 3 or 4 pictures of somebody that are close? You still have to go through the elimination process before you're effecting the arrest. Yeah. And that's what I think is the unfair knock with this, is they're treating it like it's DNA and it's not.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's important, right? Is again, understanding what those use cases really are. You give that example. Yeah, no problem putting a picture of a suspect into the hands of, hundreds of beat cops to say, be aware, go look for this somebody. But we can't do the same thing essentially with a camera that's more accurate in identifying that individual, right? To do the same thing, right? Identify and then question and follow up from there. But
yeah, if you wanted to cut down the number of stops in the street, let them have the access to the facial recognition where it lowers the pool.
Right, the higher accurate approach.
Yeah.
But people don't see it that way. For better or worse, there's misinformation out there. There's so much of that, in this day and age. And I think a lot of it comes back down to education, transparency, and trust, right? And I think for the adoption of any, new technology that can have these sorts of implications, it really comes down to those 3 elements. And right now we're really lacking in all 3 of those. Education, people don't really understand the use case, right? What that means. Can I be arrested on that? Does it just mean, it's the next step? It's being used in so many different ways. And there's so much noise out there. They don't understand the use case. There is a lot of transparency at times, right? Into how we're using it. So, that means people start to, misinformation starts to pervade. People don't post, hey, this is how we're utilizing, this is what we can do, et cetera. And the trust with whatever those institutions are, whether they're law enforcement, whether it's, a corporation deploying it, whatever the case may be, we've seen an erosion there as well, right? So, Those are the 3 elements to me that are the real impediments at the moment. Obviously, you need to put the framework, you need to put everything else in place. And that means we've got a real challenge as an industry, right, to work through those. I think the SIA guidelines help. I think we need to be advocates for the technology. We need to work on education. We need to encourage users of it, whether governments or enterprises or others, to be truly very transparent in how they're using it, what their policies are, right? Letting people understand how it's being utilized. And then, we've got to hope that we can start to enter into a world where there's greater level of trust between groups, because that is sorely lacking at the moment.
So advice for security personnel who may be interested in facial recognition solutions, and I would think that would kind of line up with the forewarning that I was giving people way back 30 years ago, I guess, when PCs first became popular, and anybody with a PC and a software programmer considered themselves to be in the access control business, right?
Yeah.
And clearly, the tools are out there now for, even, armchair developers, to create their own little facial recognition software. And it can, on the surface, it can look like it works, and it can be real cheap. But, the worst thing that can happen is when you're using it, and not to the degree to what Sal was saying is, like DNA, but, even if it's to narrow down a certain set of suspects or to be using it as a commercial tool, even for marketing, accuracy is really important. So, what advice would you give for those security personnel that are considering systems? What do they got to watch out for?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Jim. And to me, there's two things. One is, as we talked about earlier, that although the technology can be highly accurate and very sophisticated at this point, we are still at that stage where there's a wide variation between good and bad, right? So look for reputable vendors. Look for folks that have, studies, that have deployments that you can look at, that have done the testing, that are going to have the support, right? That understand, and again, understand it's not generic, right? Different use cases have different requirements, whether it's in cameras and lighting and positioning. A lot of folks sit there and they've got a camera on the entrance to their lobby, and it's 20 feet high, coming down at an angle, catching everybody sideways, and they want to use it for facial recognition, and then they wonder why it doesn't work, right? So you need to work with experts, right, to make sure that you separate the wheat from the chaff, and looking at the good technology, and it is out there and is highly capable, but you've got to understand the use case and match what you're using to the situation that you've got. So that's number one. And then number two, I think it really comes back to all the non-technology stuff, right? The things that we've been talking about here. And I think they'll see guidelines are an excellent place to start, but it really comes down to, understanding exactly what you want to use it for. It's not a panacea. It's not, hey, do everything with now. It's like, okay, it's provided to make sure only our employees are coming in and that other ones are, funneled off. It's, used to, if we've got people on a watch list, right? Whatever the case may be, to make sure that you've got transparency around the policies that you put in place. If you're using an enterprise environment, make sure your employees are aware. And we've got folks that have deployed it to make sure, they've got the right people in the right places of a building. They've got access cards, and that's fine. But then they need a higher level of granularity to make sure people, are safe in an area of a manufacturing facility where they're supposed to be. And, the initial reaction to everybody is no, right? And then you sit there and say, this is how we're using it. This is where the information is used. This is why, and the opinion changes, but it comes through that education, that transparency. So I think they'll see guidelines. Data privacy, you've got to make sure that you've got a vendor and a partner and your own tools and IT department that really can look after and make sure, privacy is a valid concern. I think, again, people don't understand everything that means. When something is a unique algorithm that can only be read by a specific vendor or software program, and if it gets hacked, it's meaningless. Just know what that means, right? But privacy is a real concern. Cybersecurity is a real concern. And so you need to make sure that you're looking at that side of the equation as well, and that you are working with someone who understands those elements and can be a trusted advisor on not just the technology, but the deployment.
Oh, that's very sound advice. Very sound advice. So I want to thank Alan for being our guest today. You've been listening to the Risk Advisor podcast, hosted by Jim Henry and Sal Lafreri. We ask you to subscribe to this show and like us on our social media sites like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. Also, if you know of someone that would make a great guest, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com and make your suggestion. Remember, you can hear the show on your favorite podcast platform. YouTube, and of course, stream it at theriskadvisor.com. Thanks again for listening, and we hope you tune in next week.